Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting Lieutenant Titus from Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2. As you can see, the very first thing I've done is sprayed him with some craggy blue spray. And with my knuckles in the way, I then went ahead and edge-lined all of the blue, or the armour, with some Nuln Oil. I then used some Abaddon Black to paint his undersuit and his weapons. Then I painted all the pouches with some Catachan flesh. Next I base coated any silver with some lead belcher. Then all the Abaddon Black, the Catachan flesh and the silver were given a wash with some Nuln Oil. Once again with my knuckles in the way, I then relayered the Catachan flesh, avoiding any of the recesses. I then used a 50-50 mix of Catachan flesh and Blood Reaver flesh for the first highlight. And this was followed by a second highlight of Blood Reaver flesh just by itself. Then to start highlighting the metal, I first relayered all of the lead belcher, making sure I avoided any recesses. This was followed by a 50-50 mix of lead belcher and Stormhost silver. And then finally Stormhost silver just by itself. For all the black details, I first started with some Corvus Black. And this was followed by a 50-50 mix of Corvus Black and Eshin Grey. And then lastly, some Eshin Grey just by itself for an edge highlight. To start highlighting the blue, I first used a 50-50 mix of Macragge Blue and Calgar Blue. And this was then followed by some Calgar Blue just by itself as an edge highlight. Then to paint his loincloth and his butt flap and one of his knee pads white, I started with a base coat of Grey Seer. And this was followed by a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and matte white. And then finally matte white just by itself. I then moved on to his skin, and for that I used some Cadian flesh tone. And then to paint his gold I used some Retributor armour. Then both the flesh and the Retributor armour were given a wash with some Reichland flesh shade. Once that wash had dried, I then used a little bit of Abaddon Black to start painting the eyes. This will be followed by matte white. And then finally a little bit of Abaddon Black for the pupils. I then relayered the skin with some Cadian flesh tone. This was followed by a 50-50 mix of Cadian flesh tone and Kislev flesh. And then finally Kislev flesh just by itself for the absolute peaks and tips. To highlight the gold, we first relayered the Retributor armour. And followed that up with a 50-50 mix of Retributor armour and Uruk armour gold. Then lastly Uruk armour gold just by itself for the absolute edges of the metal. For the red on his shoulder pad, I used some Mephiston red. And then for the purity seals, I used a little bit of corn red. Both those reds were then given a wash with some Carroburg crimson. For the paper and the rest of the detail on his shoulder pad, I then used some Rakarth flesh. There's also a wee little bone in the thing that's holding on his belt, so for that I use some Morghast bone. I'm also going to use a little bit of Catachan flesh for the string that's keeping the bone in. Ooh. Then both the Rakarth flesh and the Morghast bone were then washed with some Agrax Earthshade. While that wash dries, I'm going to paint his hair with some Abaddon Black. I then used a little bit of lead belcher for the 3 metallic dots on his head. I then gave that and his hair a wash with some Nuln Oil. Then I relayered the Rakath flesh, making sure I avoided any of the recesses. This was then highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Rakath flesh and Pallid Witch flesh. And then finally some thinned down Pallid Witch flesh for the final highlight. To highlight the red sections, I then used a 50-50 mix of Mephiston Red and Evil Sun's Scald. Then for the top of the Purity Seals, I simply used a little bit of Wazdakka Red. Then to highlight his hair, I just used a little bit of Corvus Black. To highlight the bone, I simply relayered the Morghast bone, taking care to avoid any recesses. This was then followed by a 50-50 mix of Morghast bone and Wraith bone for the highlight. For the bit of scenery you standard on, I used some Mechanicus Standard Grey for the concrete. I then used Lead Belcher to paint the little metallic pipe, and Dryad Bark to paint the muddy sections. I'm then going to texture here as the base. I'm going to use some Astro Granite, but feel free to use whatever texture paint you like, or you can use some sand and do it old school. Once that dries, I'm then going to give the base a dry brush with some Admin Grey. I'll then follow that up by painting the rim with some Admin Black. Then finally I'm going to wash the base with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. All that's left to do now is to add the transfer, so I'm going to apply a little bit of water onto the shoulder. This helps make the transfer more applicable, and you can move it if you make a mistake and you don't put it in the right place. So when applying the transfer, take care to get it in the right place as possible, and don't worry about the fact that it's not sitting straight, because we have the perfect solution for that. Ignore all those videos that tell you how to cut these transfers. You really don't need that. You just need some decal softener. Once it's in the correct position, make sure you wipe away any excess water, and then use this decal softener to very gently place on top. And what the decal softener does is it kind of helps dissolve all the transfery bits, locking the transfer in place, and kind of just basically like turning into paint. The end result is fantastic. The transfer is smooth and flat, and it looks incredible. And with that, that's Lieutenant Titus finished. And I've got to say, he's an absolute blast. A really, really lovely, quick model to paint. In fact, he's so quick, he only came in at approximately 4 hours from start to finish. I had a lot of fun painting him. I really do hope if you followed this guide, you had as much fun painting him as I did. And if you did follow this guide, please give the channel a subscribe, the video a like, and if you want to see more, then we've got plenty more stuff on the channel. 40k, Crisis Protocol, Shatterpoint, Master of the Universe Battleground, all sorts of different stuff. I guess all that is left to say is thanks for watching. I really do hope I helped, and goodbye for now.